All right, hello everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the beginning of the Cold War. So, in the previous lesson, we were looking at the differences between communism and capitalism. You can see here on this picture two of the men we're going to be discussing, especially one of them, Joseph Stalin, there on the left, and Franklin Roosevelt representing the United States in the middle. You've got the Great Britain Prime Minister Winston Churchill there on the right. What we're going to be looking at is what exactly happens after World War II that's going to lead us into this conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union that is going to be a decades long conflict. This is not something that's going to be quick. We are going to be engaged with the Soviet Union in various places throughout the entire world over the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, this conflict is going to last. So it's important to understand why, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Why is there a conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, and what were some of the results of that? And in particular, over the next few weeks, we're really going to be focusing on foreign policy. We're going to be looking at the United States and how it deals with other countries. After that, we'll be focusing more on what's going on inside the US and how people within the United States are responding to all of this. Okay, so to start with, just to kind of get our leaders straight here, President Roosevelt dies during the end of World War II. So he dies in April of 1945. The war ends in August of 1945. So the war against Germany will end in May. The war against Japan will end in August, and so President Roosevelt will not see the end of the war. His vice president, Harry Truman, then is sworn in to replace him. So all of these decisions that we're going to be talking about post World War II will be with President Harry Truman. So Truman will finish out Roosevelt's presidential term, his fourth presidential term. Truman will finish out through 1948, and then Truman decides to run for re-election in 1948. He's not super popular. People don't love him, or at least that's the initial polling, is that he doesn't rate really high among Americans. His popularity is low. People didn't think he would win the election. But then he goes on this massive campaign, and we have seen, even in recent history, how effective campaigning can be. Actually getting in front of people, meeting people, and telling them their message. And shockingly, Truman wins the election, which is considered one of the greatest upsets in history. You can see this down here, you can see this newspaper. It says Dewey defeats Truman. Dewey was the challenger. He was the Republican that was running against Truman, who is the Democrat. And the Chicago Daily Tribune, along with hundreds of other newspapers, had predicted that Dewey would win. And so they actually pre-printed these newspapers to say that Dewey was the winner. And here, this is Truman holding up this newspaper, ironically, because he actually wins. And he has one of the greatest upsets in history. I'm not going to show you this video, but I'll include the link to it if you're interested in seeing. This is actually a really fascinating election, and that talks a little bit more about what happened in the Truman election if you would like to watch that later. So, once World War II is over, it's understandable that people have a strong desire to understand and prevent the causes of war after World War I and World War II. So, in the previous several decades, there have been two massive, massive, massive conflicts, and people don't want to do that again. And so, one of the results of World War II was the establishment of the United Nations. This is a growth of the League of Nations that was formed after World War I, which the United States had not joined, but the United States does decide to join the United Nations. So 50 nations meet in June of 1945, even before the war in Japan was over, to create something called the UN Charter. And the Charter says it's committing its members to respect fundamental human rights, respect treaties and agreements, and promote the progress and freedom of all people. So the idea is we're going to try to solve things diplomatically without having to go to war. And member nations agree to live in peace. And so dozens and dozens of countries in even today, there are almost all countries in the world belong to the United Nations. There are several that don't, like North Korea, which we'll go into more next week. But countries are, the goal is here, how can we try to prevent conflict by working out our problems and promote progress and promote freedom among all people before we end up going to war. Other organizations also formed at the end of World War II. None of these are written down. None of these are on your notes. You don't need to write these down. But just to give you an idea of the other things that are going on, the World Bank was formed and the International Monetary Fund to try to promote financial relationships between countries. Again, we have the United Nations formed in 1945, and then in 1946 we have the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which is to try to open up trade between countries. It's really after World War II that countries are going to become more dependent and reliant on one another, and are going to start working more together to be more interconnected. And this is certainly where the United States is going to abandon its isolationist policy and start to get more involved in the dealings of the rest of the world. So, what's going on with the Cold War? Okay, we have three kind of roots of the Cold War, three reasons why there is going to be tension developing between the United States and the Soviet Union. The first is really philosophical, and that's what you guys were learning about in the previous lesson, in lesson 10.1, is that we have big differences between communism and capitalism. The Soviet Union in 1917 became a communist country. It has a totalitarian dictatorship, a dictator that represses people's rights and freedoms, where in the United States we have free enterprise capitalism, we have a democracy where people have freedoms, and it's a whole different way of looking at both the political system and political rights as well as economic rights. And so that's going to be a huge source of conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. Another reason for the Cold War is conflicts that happened during World War II. So again, the Soviet Union and the United States were friends. We were allies, but we weren't really friends. We were just allies. Okay, we fought on the same side, but really we fought on the same side because we were fighting a common enemy. Neither of us liked Germany, but it didn't really mean we liked each other either. And there was some disagreements about how the war should be conducted. The Soviets wanted the British and Americans to invade France much sooner than they actually did. They didn't think D-Day happened soon enough, and they were kind of fighting the brunt of the war, so they're angry about that. And the Soviet Union is also really shocked when the United States uses an atomic bomb in Japan. And that's going to worry the Soviet Union that the United States has this massive weapon that could be used against other people like them. And they're actually going to launch their own campaign and eventually will successfully build and test their own nuclear weapons as well. Another source of the Cold War, or root of the Cold War, are conflicts that happened at the end of the war. So, for example, the Soviet Union had invaded a bunch of territory like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and they had promised that they would allow those countries to have free and fair elections at the end of the war, but they don't do that. They instead continue to maintain control over those countries and impose communist dictatorships. They rig elections. They do what they can to have communist influence over those countries. And the United States is not going to want to see the Soviets expand communism into other countries. And that's going to be a huge source here of the Cold War, is that we want countries to be free and democratic and capitalist, and the Soviet Union is going to want allies and having their communist bloc of countries around them. So I think this is a really good cartoon that shows this divide, that you've got the Americans represented by the eagle and the Soviet Union, which is represented by the bear, and you've got this divide, and there's irresponsible statements. Both sides are really speaking tough against one another, and their suspicions are deepening, and that divide between the two countries will continue to grow. So Stalin then is going to want to retain political and economic control over these Eastern European countries, and as I said, he's going to install communist governments throughout Eastern Europe. So you can see where Russia is on that map down below, and then you can see countries that are going to come under Soviet control. So Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, those are all going to become a part of the Soviet Union. They will lose their independence altogether, and then places like Poland, East Germany, Czech Republic, Hungary, Romania, they will all eventually fall to communist governments as well. And the reasons for that are Stalin's going to outlaw political parties and newspapers that oppose communists. He's going to jail or kill political opponents of anyone who speaks out against communism. And he's going to rig the elections to make sure that communists win. So there's going to be a huge influence of the Soviet Union over those countries. And all of those countries that are in red will be communist countries by 1949. So again, if you look at the spread of communism, then that's a lot of red, right? On this map, you've got all of Eastern Europe, you've got the Soviet Union, eventually China will become a communist country as well, and in addition to North Korea and Mongolia. So you've got an enormous spread, and that's concerning. A lot of people in the United States are concerned that communism is spreading into such a wide range of areas. So Winston Churchill then gives this speech, and in his speech he talks about this idea of an iron curtain, the idea that communism has created a sharp divide in Europe. So you can see on that map there, that red line, that's an imaginary line. It doesn't actually exist, the line itself, but you can see all of the countries that are in green are democratic capitalist countries, and all of the countries that are in purple are communist. And you've got this divide between East and West, that there is a division that, again, it's not a real line, it's an imaginary one, but the idea that it's an iron curtain, that it's set in stone, that there is no way to find peace, or there's no way to find an agreement. It's either you belong to the West or you belong to the East, but there's no in between. And it's showing how there's kind of a standoff going on between democratic and communist countries. So Harry Truman, President Truman, is urging his Secretary of State to get tough, and that we need to do more to try to resist communist expansion. Stalin, on the other hand, as leader of the Soviet Union, thinks that this Iron Curtain is necessary to protect the Soviet Union from Western attacks. So the Soviet Union is kind of saying, we're going to build up our communist allies as a little buffer zone. Like, you can't just come and invade us across our border because we've got all these other countries that are protecting us. And so Stalin's going to use those words of Iron Curtain to say, this is the way that we Soviets and the people of the Soviet Union can protect ourselves against our enemies. And then they're going to really start to build up their military, they're going to develop nuclear technology, and they're going to start acting and trying to expand and force other countries to become communist as well. So our goal then in the United States is to create something called containment. So this was imagined by a man named George F. Kennan, and the idea of containment is that the United States should resist Soviet attempts to expand its power. So we should do whatever we can to help countries resist Soviet expansion. A lot of that means economic aid. That, remember, communists, kind of the appeal of communism is that when you're poor, it's going to raise you up and make you equal to everyone else. And so if we can prevent countries from becoming really poor, if we can provide them with the aid to allow them to grow and develop, that would be a really powerful way to prevent communism from taking over in those societies. So containment was mostly about economic aid, providing money to countries, but also sanctioning the Soviet Union and using military force if necessary, that we will do whatever it takes. So this certainly is going against the American policy of isolationism. This is now pushing for doing whatever we can to help countries, including giving them money, providing military support, and also taking actions against the Soviet Union to stop them from expanding. So lastly here then, we have something called the Marshall Plan. And the Marshall Plan is an aid program built to rebuild the economies of European countries to create stable conditions for democracies. So what this is essentially doing is just pumping tons and tons of money into Western Europe so that they have money to help their economies rebuild. What we don't want to happen is what happened in Germany. Remember, in Germany after World War I, they were completely crippled. They owed a ton of money, their economy was crap, they were experiencing massive hyperinflation, and that opened the door for someone like Hitler to come into power. We don't want that to happen in France or Great Britain or Italy again, or even West Germany again. And so we give 17 countries $13.4 billion in aid, just money that we're giving to these countries to help them rebuild so that they're not vulnerable to becoming a communist country. And it's going to build really strong political support in Western Europe. All of these countries are still allies with the United States today. If you look at these countries, they are strong allies with the United States, in part because we supported and helped them after World War II, and we helped them maintain their democracies after World War II. All right, that's it for today. Again, make sure you complete your notes outline. If you have any questions, feel free to email me or send me a message on Schoology or leave me a message on my voicemail at school, and just let me know what time you want me to get back to you, and I will give you a call back and we can review any concepts if you need any help. Talk to you guys soon.